Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about this book, Covenants Made Simple, Understanding God's Unfolding Promises to His People, written by Jonty, Rhodes. This book has been out for, I think, right around 10 years now. I've heard a lot about it from different people who have read the book and found it very helpful as kind of an introductory text to covenant theology. And so I've been wanting to read it for a long time, and I'm going to be teaching a class soon on this subject, and thought, great time to sit down and just read through this book. So I actually took a day recently and read the bulk of the book in that day. Is a very quick read. It's a very accessible and easy read. Even if you are not someone who's reads a lot of theology or something, it's a book that you could pick up, and if you have a good understanding of the Bible, he'll help you to put a lot of puzzle pieces together of kind of facts that but maybe don't know quite what they all mean or how they all fit together. And he uses the lens of covenant theology to help pull a lot of those things together in a way that's very helpful and accessible. So let me just kind of run through how this book is laid out and how it might be useful and who might find it useful. So first off, in terms of the layout of the book, he is talking about, obviously, the idea of covenants. And so he begins very early on by saying, well, what is a covenant? And he talks about how that's not a word that we use all the time, although it's still a concept that comes up in society. One of the examples that is often used, and I think he mentions this, is the idea of marriage, right? Marriage is a covenant. And central to it is it's a relationship that's founded upon certain promises or certain commitments. So he says, one way of defining a covenant, this is page 18, is a covenant is a conditional promise. And then he says we can kind of flesh that out a bit more when we think about biblical covenants. Biblical covenants are maybe a kind of a subcategory of this broader idea of covenants. And he says a covenant, biblically speaking, is an agreement between God and human beings, where God promises blessings if the conditions are kept, and threatens curses if the conditions are broken. That's his kind of bolded definition, which he'll come back to. And I love the fact that when he gives that definition, he immediately says, you could poke a lot of holes in that, you could define it differently. Some of you who maybe have read about covenant theology may fall back on something like Palmer Robertson's definition. He wrote a book called Christ of the Covenants, which was very influential in shaping kind of contemporary thinking about covenant theology. And Paul Robertson famously defined a covenant as a bond in blood sovereignly administered. That's a good definition. It captures certain things that Rhodes' definition doesn't. But I think Rhodes is actually a good way of starting, because if you're talking to someone who has never heard of the kind of concept of a biblical covenant, or they maybe have read that word in the Bible but have never really thought about it as something important, it helps to kind of define what we're dealing with. And so, having kind of laid out what is a covenant and what's a biblical covenant, what he really does is to just walk through the covenants of the Bible. And as a Presbyterian, I really appreciate the way that he does this. The thing that I found valuable about this book is that it kind of does at least two things very well. So one is to kind of walk you through the standard classic Reformed framing of these things. So he kind of deals with all of the covenants in terms of the covenant of works, the covenant that God made with Adam in Genesis, and then the covenant of grace, which would encompass kind of everything else that comes after that. That bi-covenantal, two-covenant view is very much standard traditional Westminster theology, meaning Westminster Confession of Faith. When he deals with some of the different covenants, whether it's the covenant of redemption or the Noahic covenant or the Mosaic covenant, he'll talk about how those things have sometimes been understood as being like a third thing, or some people have understood the Mosaic covenant, for example, the covenant that God made with his people at Sinai, as not so much part of the covenant of grace, but maybe just kind of a repetition of the covenant of works. And he does a good job of drawing out why people think that, but then also why he doesn't think that's the most helpful way to frame that. So he ends up kind of coming down on all the very traditional Reformed consensus views on these things. As someone who holds those views, I find that very helpful. But then the second thing that he does is not just kind of capturing the confessional theology, but communicating it in a really clear way. he really tries hard to avoid jargon as much as possible, which is really important because when Presbyterians talk about this, we can kind of just assume a lot of knowledge, we can throw out a lot of terminology, and it can very much give the impression that what we're doing is developing this beautiful system that we're then imposing upon the Bible. And I think the thing that I love about Rhodes' book is that as he's walking through covenant theology, what you feel is what's actually happening, which is that this is something that just arises out of a careful reading of the scriptures, right? This is why, just kind of departing a little bit from this book, this is why covenant theology, while it gets codified and clarified in a unique way in the Reformed tradition in the last 500 years, for example, Calvin is not making up the concept of a covenant, right? It's all throughout the Bible, and you find the earliest Christian writers, Irenaeus very famously deals with the categories and ideas of covenants, and he realized this is really important. Now, he doesn't frame and, give the taxonomy of that in the way that later Scottish Presbyterians might, for example, but he's picking up, this is really important to understand and to hold together the unity of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and to get the big picture storyline of the Bible and of the gospel. And that's really what he does. He, in the first, I think, 9 chapters or so, basically walks through, the first 8 chapters, he really walks through the different covenants. So the covenant of works, the covenant that God made with Adam. He talks about the curses and conflicts of the covenant. He talks about God's covenant with Abraham and the covenant of grace, God's covenant with Moses, God's covenant with David, the new covenant, the covenant of redemption. And what you end up kind of getting is just this like walking through the Bible, the storyline of the Bible. And he explains it in a way that's very clear for someone who's not a Presbyterian, who doesn't know the jargon, who hasn't been part of this debate, to just sort of see, oh, this comes out of the biblical text. It arises very naturally and organically. And again, he ends up touching on a lot of the debates and things that come up. Is the Mosaic covenant part of the covenant of grace or the covenant of work? Is the Noahic covenant part of this? Is there a covenant of redemption? And if so, how does it relate? So things that people who are into these debates will be asking, Rhodes still answers. But he does it in a way that's very accessible for anyone who loves the Bible. So this is a great book for someone who's never thought about covenant theology to work through these things. However, he doesn't stop with just a survey of the different covenants. Having done that, he then has 3 chapters, which are very clear, very pastoral, but where he covers a lot of ground in helping people to begin to see how this idea of covenants not only helps you in terms of your biblical theology, we might say, getting the storyline of the Bible. It's very important for that, but that it has a lot of implications for your systematic theology as well. So in those last 3 chapters, he ends up covering things like predestination and free will, church government, the sacraments, who should receive the sacrament of baptism in particular. He's talking about all sorts of things, and he does it in 3 pretty short chapters. But his answers are very clear, very helpful. So it helps someone to see, what covenant theology is, that it emerges from the Bible naturally and organically, and that it has big implications for life. Now, again, he doesn't say everything that could be said about those things, but I've read a lot of different books on, kind of intros to covenant theology, and this is the best that I've found. Just hands down, it's the best. It's very short. It's like 160, 170 pages. It's very clear. It's very focused on the Bible, but he'll introduce the terminology and the debates as they come up. It doesn't have any weird or wonky views. Sometimes you get people writing on covenant, and they pull out some aspect and really emphasize it. It's like, that's interesting, but is it overplayed? And you got to kind of balance it out. This is just a kind of very much the Westminster Confession of Faith's view of covenant theology, but articulated in a 21st century idiom. And so it's its clarity as well as its confessionalism that I find very helpful. And it's articulated in a way that, again, someone who is, just rooted in the Bible can understand and appreciate. One last thing I'll say in praise of this book, and that is that while it is the best introduction that I found to this topic, and the thing that I'm going to be recommending, to put into the hands of someone who's new to Presbyterianism as a pastor, this was also a book that, being a pastor who holds to these views and who has thought through these issues and read different things, I had so many light bulb moments in this book. And they came in 2 ways. One, he does a great job of just explaining things, giving illustrations and applications where you go, okay, I don't just have the definition of this, I can picture what that looks like or what that means. And he does a great job. You can tell he's a preacher. He's thought through not just what should I believe, but how do I communicate that? So there's a lot of great light bulb moments in terms of, oh, that's a great way of explaining this concept to someone. So that was helpful. But it was also helpful in that as he's walking through those covenants, he's drawing out how the storyline of the Bible interconnects and overlaps, and how there's all these redemptive historical connections, we might say, between things. So just two that come to mind, thinking about, Satan's words in the garden, and to think about how in breaking the covenant of works, right? How does Satan do that? Well, he tells them, take and eat, right? That will bring you knowledge, that will bring you life. Well, then you go to the new covenant. Christ is instituting the new covenant and is fulfilling the covenant of works. And he does that by saying these words to his disciples, take and eat. But it's not a breaking of the covenant, it's a keeping of the covenant. It's life coming through the sacrifice of Christ. Wow, these great connections. Another one I'd never seen before, he draws out that when the Mosaic covenant is being instituted, right? Moses comes down from the mountain, and what does he find? God's people have broken his law even as he's giving it to them. And we read that 3,000 people are struck down by the sons of Levi. God's holiness, God's presence is this consuming fire that brings 3,000 people from life to death, right? This really striking scene. Well, then you go to the New Testament and you read in the book of Acts, and Pentecost takes place, and God's Spirit, his presence, is poured out in this unique way. And I've always seen, or not always, but for a long time I've seen people who have pointed out very helpfully that Pentecost is a reversal of Babel, right? In Babel you have the dividing of tongues as people try to build their kingdom. In the Pentecost, God unites their tongues as he's building his kingdom. So there's this reversal of Babel. But there's also this contrast with the Mosaic covenant. Because in the Mosaic covenant, the people are breaking it, God's presence is poured out, and 3,000 are consumed. In Pentecost, God's presence is poured out not as a consuming fire, but as a sanctifying fire, and we read 3,000 people are converted, right? So there's the same number, which also begins to make sense of some of the things that Paul will do in 2 Corinthians, for example, where he's drawing out this, aroma of life to life or death to death, the different work of the Spirit, the contrast between the law with Moses and the Spirit and the New Testament. So again, just it opens up all these worlds. And there were things like that in every single chapter, literally, where it was just like, wow, that's a great way of looking at it. That's a great way of expressing it. So this is a book that, if you have never read covenant theology, I would say this is the book I would hand to you. And if you've read 100 books on covenant theology, I think you'll still find this really helpful, both in terms of thinking about how to explain it to someone who hasn't encountered it before, and in terms of seeing connections and nuances and things that maybe you haven't appreciated in the past. So I cannot more highly recommend this wonderful book, Covenants Made Simple, Understanding God's Unfolding Promises to His People by Jonty Rhodes.